Since we have identified resource concerns and documented benchmark or existing conditions and the effects of no action, it's time to move into step 5 to formulate alternatives. This version of the form adds tools to assist planners to formulate alternatives by land use. The tools use the practice points from CART to help the planner identify practices to address resource concerns that are identified in the benchmark or existing conditions columns. Any resource concern that is present, as identified with a red highlight, will be automatically included in the tool. The tool will filter out resources that are not concerns and practices that do not have positive effects for the identified resource concerns, allowing the planner to quickly identify practices to address the resource concerns. In the existing condition column, note the resources that are identified as concerns. They are highlighted in red. Resources that are not concerns are highlighted in green. Note that if multiple land uses are present in the plan, you could use the individual land use tool for each land use to formulate the alternatives for each land use. Since our plan only consists of cropland, we will click on the crop button to formulate alternatives for the cropland. The tool opens. Note that practices that have positive effects are listed in the rows, and identified resource concerns are listed in the columns on the right. At the top of the form is a minimum level to display cell that shows the default value of 5. In this case, any practice that has points value of 5 or more will display. If the planner wishes to narrow the list down to practices that only have better effects, the minimum level can be changed in multiples of 5. For example, changing the level to 20 would result in less practices, but would include only those practices that had better effects. We're going to leave the value at 5. If the value is changed, the planner would need to click the Identify Practices with Positive Effects button to refresh the results. Also, if the planner clicks the Show All Practices button, all practices will display regardless of point value. At this point, the planner should use their experience, help from more experienced planners, or knowledge of practices in their area to select practices. For example, in this area, conservation crop rotation, cover crops, residue use no-till, and nutrient management are common practices. So let's select those practices by typing the letter P in the column under primary or supporting. Make sure that you press enter or click on a different cell after you type the letter in for each row. Then we will click the Show Selected button. Notice that those practices do a good job of addressing the sheet and rill erosion concern, the sediment concern, and the nutrient loss concerns, but do not have much effect on ephemeral gully erosion or bank erosion, so we need to add some more practices to address those concerns. Click the Identify Practices with Positive Effects button to show all the practices that have positive effects. As we scroll down the list, we can see that grass waterway has very good effects for ephemeral gully erosion, and stream bank and shoreline protection have good results for bank erosion. So we're going to select those practices by entering the letter P in the column under the primary or secondary. Once again, we will scroll to the top and click the Show Selected button again. As we look at this set of practices or alternative, the practices are predicted to have effects that will address all the resource concerns. This alternative may be a good one to present to the client. So let's click the Copy Selected to Alt 1 button to save it as Alternative 1. The planner may also want to print this page to create a site-specific practice effects worksheet to document the effects of this alternative. The page is formatted to print the document automatically by just clicking File Print, or the planner may wish to use Print Preview to review before printing. Once we are through printing, we can return to the spreadsheet. Note that supporting practices generally will not have any points for selected resource concern and therefore may not be displayed on the list. If the planner wishes to see all practices, they may click the Show All Practices button and enter the letter S by any needed supporting practice, or the practice may be added later in the practices table. For our example, we will add supporting practices later. The planner may continue this process to create another alternative. Let's consider this example. Although Alternative 1 addresses the resource concerns, we may want to consider some human considerations. For example, the stream bank stabilization practice may be costly to implement and may take some land out of production. Let's review some other practices to address the bank erosion concern. Click the Identify Practices with Positive Effects button again, and scroll through the practices, reviewing the effects for bank erosion. Notice that riparian forest buffer has good effects for bank erosion and would be less costly to install and would probably not take as much land out of production. We will select that practice by entering the letter P in the column under Primary or Supporting, and deleting the P out of the column in Stream Bank Stabilization. We will scroll to the top and click the Show Selected button. As we evaluate the new practices, and we see a new alternative, and although the riparian forest buffer will not totally address the bank erosion, it does have good positive effects at less cost and loss of land to production. If those considerations are important to the client, the planner should evaluate those. Let's click the Copy Selected to Alternative 2 button to save these practices as Alternative 2. A second site-specific practice effects worksheet can also be printed for this alternative. Once we have printed the worksheet, we can return to the spreadsheet. We have now created two alternatives for the client. Return to the CPA 52 by clicking the link at the top of the page.